Hey guys, welcome back to Kine 610. I hope your weeks are going well. We are continuing to go through this module, and this particular module is broken down into really two key components. And that first component is what we call patient-rated outcome measures, and that's what we'll spend the time on in this online lecture. But then there's also a second component to this module, which is the disablement model, which will warrant its own online lecture as well. So for today, what we're going to focus on are the patient-rated outcome measures, which to me really truly are key in the process of evidence-based practice. We're going to talk about why that is and what patient-rated outcome measures are, and then you'll spend the majority of the time in the modules learning about individual specific types of patient-rated outcome measures. So the first thing that I do really is I want to bring you back to the original model of evidence-based practice, right? And so here's this original model. And what we've kind of said throughout the class is this, that evidence-based practice incorporates both the best available research or the best research evidence. It takes into account the clinical expertise of the clinician actually practicing. And then it also kind of considers these patient values and preferences, and also the patient experiences, right? And so kind of what we've talked about so far in this class has been the clinical experience of the clinician. And then we've also talked about the best research evidence. And we've probably spent at least 70% of the class in this area. We're learning how to appraise and read research. We're kind of deciding what research is good quality versus bad quality, right? And then this is natural to us. So for those of you that are clinicians, this is a natural daily occurring process for us, right? We always are implementing our clinical expertise into what we are doing. And that doesn't matter if we're an athletic trainer or a physical therapist versus a clinical exercise physiologist, or let's say a personal trainer or a strength and conditioning coach. The reality is we all are clinical experts in the area that we work. The area that we really haven't focused on, and that's kind of been intentional, is this area right here. And this area, to me, really honestly holds a lot more weight than it actually gets credit for. And so we're going to spend time talking about that because the evidence-based process is integral in the treatment of your patients in the clinical setting. And believe it or not, the evidence-based process does involve all three of these variables. So the best research evidence, coupled with your clinical expertise, and then most importantly, how the patient perceives that treatment or intervention went when they're ready to leave your clinic or your personal training session. And so today, the whole purpose of this is to really kind of complete the loop of evidence-based practice. In other words, for evidence-based practice to fully be implemented, we really have to start looking at outcomes, right? Outcomes that demonstrate the effectiveness of your treatment, your intervention, your strength training program, right? Why? Because these outcomes, they get collected, they get synthesized, and then it allows you to really draw some clinical conclusions about that intervention, about that treatment, about that strength and conditioning program that you applied to a specific team over a season. So outcomes research is crucially important. It's not very difficult to capture. In other words, you really just look at how the patient progressed over time. And one of the ways to do that is through these subjective patient-rated outcome measures, right? A lot of what we do as clinicians is very objective, right? We have special tests, and those are black or white. In other words, they're positive or they're negative. The patient has the disease or they don't have the disease. They have the injury or they don't. But when we talk about patient-rated outcomes, it's a whole new ballpark because what we're really doing is we are relying on the patient's perspective. In other words, it's very subjective in nature. And a lot of people in research and a lot of clinicians kind of shy away from this type of data because the reality is it relies on patient recall. And we all know we've had patients who can't remember what happened yesterday. And so it becomes crucial to understand how these patient-rated outcomes really are important. And then most importantly, I think, is it becomes more important to understand what type of patient-rated outcome would be best served by the field that you're in, by the setting that you're in, so that way you can really truly choose a patient rated outcome measure that would tell you something about your treatment and or your intervention. So patient-oriented evidence is really the collection of outcomes, and again, it demonstrates the effectiveness of those treatments that you're using in your clinic, in your facility, but most importantly, it gives it to us from the patient's perspective. And as a clinician, you guys, I think that's vital information, right? So what if they had an increase in strength? So what if they returned to play? What if they still don't feel very well? What if they still don't feel strong? What if they still don't feel stable? To me, that tells me something. So overall, what I'm going to say is this right here. Patient-oriented evidence is said to be one of the most valuable outcome evidence for you as a clinician to utilize, because not only does it take into account the patient's perspective, but it also gives you a snapshot into whether or not the intervention or the treatment that you're using is really effective from a patient's perspective. And to me, that's crucial information. So what we're going to do for the rest of this online lecture really is just talk about what a patient-rated outcome measure is, and then what the components of a patient-rated outcome measure are, so that you know what you should look for in a good patient-rated outcome measure. And so what we kind of do is we start with this Venn diagram here, right? And on your left-hand side, what you have is the patient's health, right? And then what you have on the right-hand side is the patient's quality of life. So in other words, how healthy are they? And then how does that translate over to what they're able to do? If they're able to walk, if they're able to sit, if they're able to pick up their backpack, if they're able to type at their desk, if they're able to just walk, right? And up until evidence-based practice actually came out, we kind of treated these two as separate entities. In other words, we looked at the patient's health and we kind of looked at the quality of life, but we never combined the two and said, okay, if a person has bad health, then essentially, right, it's going to impact their quality of life. But the problem with that is that we never really truly asked our patients how they felt, what things in maybe their overall life, not their sport, right, not their task, but their life was also being impacted. So that's where evidence-based practice came in. And what we did as researchers is we kind of combined the two, and we created these health-related quality of life outcomes called patient-rated outcome measures. And so what this does is it really combines the two components, the components of health and the components of quality of life, into one major measurement tool. And then these measurement tools are way patient-centered. And what they do ultimately is, I think they really inform your clinical decision making. So you take those objective measurements and you take those patient-centered outcome measurements and you really combine them to make the best decision for the patient that's sitting in front of you, or for the group of patients that's sitting in front of you. And to me, that's a more comprehensive, it's a more robust type of treatment or intervention or clinical practice for your patient, because ultimately the other patients that come through your clinic benefit from this type of research. So ultimately, when we're looking at a patient-rated outcome, and we'll talk about this a lot in the module, we've kind of embedded all of the different patient-rated outcomes that are currently available. But what good does it do to know the 100 patient-rated outcome measurements that exist if you don't know how to disseminate or to determine whether or not that patient-rated outcome measure is a good patient-rated outcome measure or a reliable patient-rated outcome measure to use? So when you look at patient-rated outcome measures, what you really want to look at are 6 key components. And I'm not going to go into depth here because we have 6 different content pages dedicated to each of these 6 components. But what you want to make sure of is this, that your patient-rated outcome measure is applicable, that it can measure responsiveness. So this goes back to module 5, the evidence-based statistics, the minimal clinically important difference or the minimal detectable change. In other words, how much change do we need to see in order for a patient to truly be determined that they actually improved? We also want that patient-rated outcome measure to be comprehensive, right? In other words, to cover different facets of the quality of that patient's life. When available, what we want to know is how reliable is that measurement. And what you'll see in the research literature is that a lot of the patient-rated outcome measures have reliability statistics reported with them. Then the last two are probably most important. The practicality of it. Can you actually really use this in the clinical setting? How long is it going to take you? How long does it take the patient? Does it take away from the time that you could be spending doing rehab? So we want to make sure that the patient-rated outcome measure that you choose is something that can be done quickly and something that's practical for you to do in the setting that you're actually working in. And then last but not least, I think reliability and validity really are linked. It's more of an accuracy thing, right? How accurate is that patient-rated outcome? So when we pick up a patient-rated outcome, when you do that in this module, what you want to do is you want to be able to identify the 6 key components to a really good, comprehensive patient-rated outcome measure. So with that being said, what I wanted to do is just say this, that patient-rated outcome measures really provide information related to markers of healthcare effectiveness. In other words, the effectiveness of your treatment, the effectiveness of the intervention, the effectiveness of your strength and conditioning program, the effectiveness of a medication. Okay, you get my point, right? I'm kind of rambling on. But not only the effectiveness, but the quality of that program. And those two things become highly important to any clinician, right? How effective was it? And then what was the quality like for that particular patient? And this is my personal opinion, that these patient-rated outcome measures should be an integral component of what you as clinicians do when you're treating or intervening or rehabbing your patients. What we're starting to see is this right here, especially if you're a physical therapist. As healthcare policy kind of transitions, what we're starting to see is that it's moving towards improving patient perceptions of their own outcomes. And so in other words, what we're starting to see, at least in physical therapy, is that sometimes physical therapists and physicians are not getting reimbursed if they don't actually incorporate some type of patient-rated outcome measure. And so we see this when we go visit a physician, and now that physician is kind of sitting down at a computer, asking us specific questions, and they're taking more time. And part of that is the transition in healthcare policy and the need to know how our patients actually feel. So in addition to the change or the transition in healthcare, it's just important to know what your patient perceives they're getting from you. Last but not least, what you'll see is that there really are 2 different types of patient-rated outcome measures. There are what we call generic patient outcome measures, and then there are what are called specific patient-rated outcome measures. We'll kind of talk about the differences between the 2. So overall, the goal of this module is to introduce you to patient-reported outcome measures that currently exist, to kind of let you dive through those and figure out what the characteristics are, and to look for those 6 characteristics. And then to really just talk to you guys about how to incorporate patient-rated outcome measures into your clinical practice if you are a clinician. So it is critical to remember that some patient outcomes will be very generic, meaning they kind of span across the practice setting, and they cover a whole gamut of the health quality of life. And then others are going to be very specific, joint-driven, illness-driven. Ultimately, we just need to figure out how this best applies to you, if it applies at all. So thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to your responses in the actual module.